Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the Navigating an Ancient Faith podcast. My name is David Gortney, and with me is J.R. Gortney.
Hey, how you doing?
And like I said in the first episode, if you listen to episode 1, we are actually not remote talking from Tennessee and Florida. We are actually both in Florida sitting in the same room.
Yep, that's right, man. We hit the pool a little bit earlier.
That's right.
We got a steak in our future. Yeah, this is nice, man. I like this a whole lot.
Yeah, this is the way to do it.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we'll try and keep it short because we do have dinner reservations at a nice steakhouse tonight.
Yeah, that's right. I'm not missing that one.
So hopefully we won't rush through this episode. But we are in the middle of a 4-part episode on the book of Colossians. As I explained last time, we are going through the big ideas of Colossians by looking at the big idea in each chapter. And I kind of laid a couple of the ground rules last week that this isn't a verse-by-verse study. We're looking at the big ideas of each chapter, so we're kind of following along with the flow of Paul, but then we're stopping on a couple of verses, handful of verses, and really pulling out what the meaning is. And how to determine the meaning is what we said last week, is really thinking about what the original hearers would have understood, because we're talking about Greco Romans, Greeks who lived in, well, in this case it was in Asia Minor, but
Right.
Still really Greek culturally, and who came out of a pagan society. Actually,
Right.
They were still much immersed in a pagan society.
Yeah.
They had become Christians. So Paul was talking to Christians whose background, though, was very much immersed in pagan philosophy and Greek mythology, you might say.
Right.
Yeah, and Greek culture. And we talked a little bit last week, just to recap, about how we read these 2,000 years later through the lenses of so many translations of theologians and great minds to say, here's what this means in the big picture, which isn't wrong, but it tends to bury just how the original hearer would have heard things.
Yeah, when you have the original culture in mind, it is a lens to view what Paul is saying through.
Yeah.
That's right.
So last episode, we talked about Colossians 1:15 through 20, and we really talked about how Paul was telling 2 creation stories, one of original creation, Jesus was there from the beginning creating all this, and then the new creation story, which is God was reconciling all things to himself, again, through his Son, Jesus, and again, all things in heaven and on earth, everything created, was being brought under the reign of Christ.
Yeah, that's right. And before the Greek myths, there was Jesus, and he was there with God, and is that the actual embodiment of God. And so, so going back further in time to anything that they would have known or understood, there was God and Jesus. And so he was kind of establishing that fact from the jump.
Yeah. So today we're going to move on to Colossians chapter 2. I think you can summarize a little bit about the flow of Paul's argument, and then we're going to stop at chapter 2, verses 16 and 17 in particular, and talk about kind of a veiled reference that Paul is referring to.
Yeah, you mentioned
that's
that
kind of unpacking
end of the last podcast.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to getting there. But yeah, leading up to that, Paul's kind of talking about, and you mentioned this last week, about the heresies that are happening in the Colossian church. And so they're kind of getting off track. They've gotten off target from their original intent of what they were taught. And so they're kind of running down all these little rabbit trails and trying to find spirituality through other lesser. They were trying to find their spirituality through something other than Christ. And we talked about cheap grace or cheap spirituality last week, and how we kind of do the same thing. We try to recreate the original. And Paul reminded them, it's like, don't try to recreate the original. You have access to the person that was before all time, before all existence. You have access to him. So why in the world are you trying to chase after these silly little imitations?
Cheap imitations.
Cheap imitations, right. So he kind of goes through this stuff. So he's kind of warning them about heresy. And so he kind of introduces the second chapter, and I'll start in verse 8, where he says, "Be careful that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deceit based on human tradition, based on the elemental forces of the world and not based on Christ." So there's this kind of idea right from the get-go that, first of all, that Greeks were fascinated and loved philosophy.
Yeah.
That's what Athens was based on, right? And it's one of those things that they could get mired down in different philosophies, and they loved different philosophies, and they loved new ideas, which is why Paul, we've talked about this before, about why there's not a book of Athens. There's not a letter.
Yeah, that's right. There's not a letter.
Church.
Yeah.
and we know Paul was there. He mentions being there, but at the same time, it's almost like he saw all this fascination with philosophy, and he had listeners undoubtedly, but they also just sort of wanted to put that as another one of their philosophies that are just as valid as all the other philosophies.
Yeah.
And it's almost like Paul realized, I'm not going to get anywhere with these people. They've got a million different philosophies. They've even got the statue to the unknown God. And it's like, what does that even mean? And it's like it's almost like he just rolled his eyes and moved on,
Yeah.
That's me paraphrasing that. I don't know. But but don't be caught up by these philosophies that the Greeks were known to be partial toward. And so, and based on the elemental forces of the world, which I think was interesting because he's kind of saying, look, that's based on this material world that you're fixated on. But remember, there's the invisible and the visible, and we need to bring both of those into focus and quit focusing on just the elemental forces of the world, but focus on Christ. So that's kind of how he starts that out, and just gives them that warning: don't get caught up in these bogus philosophies. And then he goes on. Well, I'll let you continue, but then he goes on with the idea of what reality and what the ideal actually is.
Yeah. Well, and so one note too is when he says don't get caught up in these philosophies, a lot of people would say that he's referring to a certain philosophy that was circling through Colossae. It wasn't just say, hey, stop studying philosophy.
Right.
There's a lot we can learn from some of these philosophies, some Stoicism and the works of Plato and Socrates and stuff like that, and we're going to reference that in a minute. But the way it's written is it's a particularly deceptive philosophy, and it's probably a specific philosophy that he had in mind that the Colossians were going, hey, that's intriguing to me. Look at that shiny object over there. Let's run over there and play with that for a while,
Yeah, that's right.
But that leads us up to verses 16 and 17, and these are the verses that we're going to focus on today. So Colossians 2:16 says, therefore, kind of based on everything that you had just summarized, therefore, don't let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon, celebration, or a Sabbath day. These things are shadows of things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. So verse 16 says, quit judging each other by what you eat, by what you drink, by what festivals you attend, by what you don't attend. And so it really brings out this idea that maybe there was a lot of measuring the people's spirituality in the Colossian church, basically on what they were attending and whether or not they were following all the rules.
Check all the boxes.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
And so it's like, I can judge how spiritual you are because, you showed up to the Wednesday night service and you were early for Sunday school and you attended small group every week and so you're obviously a very spiritual person.
Yeah, and if I read this verse as a modern, I sit there and say, don't judge. Quit judging. Don't judge me. You have no right to judge me. Don't.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So we love to embrace that idea of non-judgmentalism. And in fact, if you're a judgmental person, that's the worst thing you can possibly be, right? But that's the question: is Paul telling us, don't judge? Don't call anybody out for the food or the what they drink or anything like that. Don't judge. Don't discern. What's he saying there?
Yeah, well, you mentioned this earlier that I think that we have the Sunday school interpretation of this, which is on one hand, don't judge others by any of this, but on the other hand, we can also take it as, well, I don't have to do any of this stuff because Paul says don't judge me by it, so.
Right, none of that stuff matters.
Yeah.
And he mentions the Sabbath. He mentions the Sabbath day, which is in the law, right? Now, the New Moon Festival, I'm not familiar with that one, but you know what I mean. But yeah, it's interesting that he mentions a pagan festival and the Sabbath day, which is certainly Jewish.
Yeah, and religious festivals. So, there could be references to both pagan festivals and, Sabbath days. It's like, hey, don't judge someone because they showed up at that festival that you think is,
right. Yeah.
over the line, and at the same time that they did or didn't show up, Sabbath day,
Yeah. That's right. And so, he's basically saying you can't judge anybody on those things.
Yeah.
But he's not saying...
There's a lot more to it than that, though, yeah.
Right. So he's not saying you don't have the right to judge anybody, but he is pointing out that all these festivals and things that they have in place, or in a modern context, the fact that you went to church on Wednesday night and Sunday and things like that, he does point out in verse 17 that those are just shadows of what's to come. That
Yes.
the substance is the Messiah. So what does he mean by when he talks about a shadow? That's just a shadow of what's to come.
Yeah, it's one of those interesting verses that it's easy to just read through. These are shadows of things to come, but the reality is Christ.
Yeah.
That's verse 17. To a first century Greco Roman person who grew up in Greek culture, like those two words, shadow versus the reality, would have a pretty clear connotation. And we have to go back to the writings of Plato to really understand what I think Paul is kind of roundabout way of referring to. And again, we talked about this, but it's easy to go, well, we don't know that Paul meant that. And maybe he didn't, but at the same time, you have to ask the question, how would a person immersed in Greco-Roman culture and mythology in the Roman Empire first century, what would be the first thing they thought of?
Sure. They think of Socrates, right?
Yeah, and I think you got to go back to this story of Plato where he talks about Socrates. Yeah, so let's talk about this idea of Plato and the cave.
Yeah, I vaguely remember the story, the fire, the shadow.
Yeah.
They mistook the shadows for reality.
Yeah.
But yeah, you'll have to catch me up.
Yeah, so just a quick overview, and the story is fascinating. The more I read it, the more I love the story. But it's in the middle of this whole dialogue, but Socrates is talking to someone else, Glaucon, and he says, okay, imagine this with me for a second. And, he kind of starts to tell this kind of fantastical tale, but it sets up the illustration. So he says, imagine that there are people who have been imprisoned basically in a cave since their childhood, so they can't remember the outside world. As far as they can remember, they've lived in a cave and they're chained to the cave.
Yeah.
And they can't even turn around. But behind them are guards who are guarding them, and the guards have fire going to keep warm, things like that. And so all that these prisoners see, all these people who are in the cave, all they see is a shadow on the wall before them, right? Because the guards have their fire. And he even says, the guards start messing with them. They see shadows on the wall. And they start taking images like something that looks like a dog, right? And the prisoners start to go, oh, well, that's a dog.
Right.
And they can hear sound coming from the back. So they go, well, the reality is what's in front of us, right? That looks like a dog. That looks like a cat. That looks like a bear, maybe,
Right.
That looks like another person. And so in their world, in that cave, the reality is these things.
Shadow.
Yeah. These shadows in front of me, that's reality.
Right.
That's their world.
Right.
And it's interesting, and I'll pick the story up here, but it's interesting because you and I did some hiking in the Cappadocia region where it's actually very easy to imagine people living in caves because...
Yeah, one of the most fascinating places I've ever been. We absolutely had a fantastic time. But yeah, it was just, imagine just Swiss cheese, mountain full of holes that you could climb all through. It was absolutely fantastic. But yeah, you're right. Is we would get deep down in some of these caves. It's unbelievable how deep they went. And these were all man-made. But yeah, we'd climb through these holes and things like that. And so yeah, you can kind of see the idea of fires burning, torches burning, shadows being cast all over the walls, and shadows dancing all over the place. Yeah, that's right.
Well, and even recently, we both had watched something about, I think, Nevashir or something is one of these huge underground cities in that region that we didn't even go to see. And it's a good excuse now that we have to go back.
Yeah, we're going to have to go back. That's
but
right.
They were these huge underground cities that were 6, 8, 10, 12 stories deep underground. And it was obvious that people lived there for a long time. So maybe it's not so far-fetched that someone could have given birth, right?
Sure.
And depending on what was going up top, whether it was some kind of catastrophic event or invaders going through, that, some little kid could grow up. And their reality was the cave, right?
Right. Yeah, that's right. That's all they knew.
Yeah. So I think that's kind of a good setting to keep in mind that, this might be, today we might say, this is far-fetched, but it may not be so far-fetched in terms of the ancient world,
Right.
So anyway, Socrates sets the stage like these prisoners see reality as the shadows in front of them, right?
Right.
And Then he says, so let's imagine that one of these people eventually escape, or the guard lets one of them go. I'm kind of paraphrasing the whole story, but this one has a chance to escape. And so he starts to slip out. He gets out of his chains. He heads up to the cave entrance. And as he's going up to the entrance of the cave, it starts to, of course, get bright out. And his eyes hurt, right?
Yeah.
His eyes haven't adjusted.
Yeah, like going out after a movie theater.
Yeah.
It's a movie theater in the middle of the day, right?
You're immediately blinded. And he talks about how to this person who's actually starting to approach the entrance of the cave from the depths of the cave, that this is kind of an unpleasant experience even.
Yeah, sure. It's painful.
Yeah, it's painful. His eyes hurt. He's disoriented. He can't see anything. But he continues up to the cave entrance and finally looks outside. And once his eyes adjust, and he may even be tempted to turn around and go back, like, this is awful, right?
Right.
But when his eyes adjust, suddenly, like, he looks out and there's the sun shining outside. You know, there's the ocean out in front of him, and it's beautiful, and there's actual birds flying around, you know, and you can kind of
right.
paint your own picture.
Yeah.
And suddenly this guy sees actual reality.
Right.
He recognizes, no, this is the world that's real.
Yeah, that's right.
Not
Plato
down
calls that his forms, right?
Yeah. So Plato, off of this, fleshes out this idea of the ideal forms that, and we'll get to that. It's kind of one of the things he's trying to make. But he was like, you know, what's in the cave is just the shadows. What's out here, that's reality. And beyond even that, Plato would say, beyond that would exist these ideal forms. So even what we see in our material world is just a representation of what an ideal of any one thing might be, right?
Okay, yeah.
And so that's where we kind of start, we say things like, you know, we have to aim for the ideal.
Yeah, Plato's the one who said there exists the ideal circle. The idea of a circle actually exists in perfection. But it does, independent of all the circles that we come in contact with in our daily lives, and everything we see is an imperfect representation of that ideal circle. Right. Yeah, and that's his idea of the forms. It's the ideal.
Yeah.
Right? That's right. Okay.
Yeah, so that's actually a good way to describe this is we can draw circles. We all know what a circle is, but Plato would say all these circles that you see are only
flawed copies.
A flawed copy of what an ideal circle is.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And the ideal exists independently of all the other circles.
Right. So that's what Plato's bigger picture is here. But to continue with the story then of the cave is so the guy realizes how wonderful the real world is out here. It's beautiful. The ocean, the breeze, the sunshine, birds, you know, all this. And he starts to think about his buddies back in the cave. And of course, what's he going to say, you know?
Sure. Yeah. He's going to go back and
I got to go tell him
about what he's seen. Sure.
Yeah. So he says, imagine this guy goes back in the cave and, you know, maybe the guards aren't looking or something. And he goes to his buddies and he says, hey, you'll never believe what's out there. You know, there's this whole, and he tries to describe to them the ocean and the sun and the birds that fly. And, you know, he's like, you should see what a real bird is. And to his surprise, some may respond to him, but some would be like, no, what you're describing as a bird is not a bird. He's like, the bird, we know what a bird is. It's that gray shadow on the wall that flies by every now and then, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And the sun, what are you talking about? Like, you know, the sun is this weak, glowing light that we see on the cave wall, you know.
Right.
That's light.
Yeah.
And they actually, and so as Socrates tells his story, they actually start to get upset with him. The more he tries to tell them, you have to come view reality.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
They start to get upset with him, and even to the point where one of them says, basically, if we could get our hands on you, we would kill you. We would threaten to kill you, basically, for kind of trying to upend our view of the world.
Trying to shatter what we think is reality.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so this sounds a lot like The Matrix, right?
Yeah, I think you could say The Matrix is probably just a modern retelling of Plato's cave.
Okay, yeah. There's the Matrix that we're living in, and the assumption is that's reality. And then, of course, he's pulled out and finds out what true reality is. And I think what's interesting about The Matrix is that even though, I forget the character's name, but one of the guys, even though he knew that he was in the Matrix, I mean, that the Matrix wasn't reality, he chose to go back to the matrix. He wanted the steak. He wanted
That's right.
He wanted the comfort. He didn't want to live in the real world. He wanted
Yeah.
to live in the matrix. And that's kind of one of the interesting twists in that story, is that why would anybody choose the shadow over reality? But that's exactly what he chose, because the shadow was more comfortable. So
Yeah.
Plato's saying, that the friends that were angry with the guy who actually saw reality was upset that he was trying to upend or that he was trying to destroy their reality.
Yeah, the guy was comfortable with his shadow world.
Yeah. That's right. Yes, yeah.
The guy was
he knew the
comfortable
shadow
with it.
world, and he wanted to stay there.
Even though none of it was real, his steak was, his
Yeah.
steak was nice. The woman in the red dress, right? There was something like the woman in
that's
the
right.
red dress. Is it the red pill or the blue pill?
I forget. That's actually like a common saying. You got red pill.
You got
or
red pilled or blue pilled.
I forget what.
I would use
forget.
it, although I would always say the wrong one because I can't remember.
Yeah. Well, we'll watch it. We'll bring it up. We'll check it out.
Yeah.
We may edit this out.
The point is Neo takes a pill, right?
Right. Yeah. That's right.
Yeah, so actually the pills are, one will help you see reality, and the other you can go back to the shadow.
Right. Yeah. That's right.
Yeah. And the other parallel, I guess, now that we're talking about it, with the Matrix and the cave, is that initially reality is not a beautiful place.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. It's painful.
It's painful.
Painful on the eyes. Yeah. You've adjusted to the shadows. You've adjusted to the cave.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, you're right. It's like we said, coming out of a movie in the middle of the day.
Yeah, and the real world is ugly and messy, but that whole kind of virtual world he was living in wasn't real. And so he has this
But
choice.
It was simpler.
It was simpler, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So that was the choice. It's like, do I want to exist in that simple world that's not real, or do I want to exist in the real world that's kind of ugly and messy right now? You know?
Do I want to stay in a place where it's simple, but at least I know the rules? Or do I want to go out into this messy, complex world that's actual real, but it's also I don't understand how everything works, and I can't have complete understanding. And yeah, that's right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's the allegory of the cave that Plato talks about through the person of Socrates. Imagine that this took place, and kind of the question that he would pose is, which reality would you rather live in? Your cave, where everything's known, comfortable, you have names for everything, or the outside world, what's real?
Yeah.
And actually, Plato, one of his points is he takes it kind of one step further and says, those who won't engage in philosophy are going through their everyday lives content with the shadows on the wall. They don't see what the bigger picture is. And that's where Plato starts to pull in this idea of the ideals, the ideal forms.
Yeah. And you see that, you kind of see this today. You see people that don't want to engage in any type of conversation. They like the narrative that they're engaged in. And you kind of see this on news shows and on television, where you almost have this response of burying your head in the sand intentionally because you don't want to hear what another person has to say about something, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so you've got your narrative. This is what I want to live by. I'm not interested in anybody else's alternative view of my narrative.
Yeah, I like to have my ears tickled with people who think and say the same thing that I would say.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm just going to kind of stay in my tunnel vision world, and
right.
I'm going to stay in the shadow world here. And
yeah, they're saying that people look for confirmation, not information.
Yeah,
and yeah,
confirmation
so that's
bias.
Kind of that. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, so all those kind of ideas are the same thing of what Plato's really getting at, this idea of the shadow versus reality. And that's why I say, so let's go back to Colossians 2:17 then, where Paul says, don't let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, and festivals and new moons and Sabbath day. Let's read this verse again then. These are a shadow of things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. And to me, like, okay, that whole verse just opens up to me.
Yeah,
right?
You're right.
Right.
Suddenly we're not thinking about, well, okay, can I or can I not drink? Just answer that for me, right?
Yeah.
Can I have a glass of wine or not?
Tell me what to do.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and that's kind of what the simple person, that's what he says.
Yeah.
Tell me what to do. What are the rules?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
So when Paul, I think it's pretty clear that when Paul says, well, let's put it this way, when a first century person growing up in Greco Roman culture would have heard Paul talk about the shadow versus reality, I mean, you're going to Plato.
Yeah.
You're going to the cave, right?
Yeah, that's right. Sure.
That's your first thought. And Paul had to have known that. So it's one of those things that even if it's not completely true, but I think there's a lot of truth to it. That's where they would have gone, and that's would have been their paradigm. Okay, this is what Paul's talking about.
Right.
Am I going to stay in my cave and watch the shadows, or am I actually going to get out there and participate in the reality?
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's also important to point out that the shadow he's not saying the shadows don't exist.
Right, right.
The shadows actually point to reality, but we point to the shadow and say, this is what matters. So what do the shadows represent then?
Well, yeah, so shadows definitely represent, well, so let's just think about it. Like shadows represent the presence of something real, right?
Right. Yeah.
If nothing existed, there wouldn't be a shadow to cast.
Yeah, that's right.
So the shadow, I think we can think about it in terms of the shadow is actually pointing to something.
Okay.
And
so
the shadow...
He's not saying don't ignore the Sabbath and don't ignore the festivals or whatever.
Yeah, I don't think so.
So you don't think he's condemning those things?
No, I don't think so. Certainly not a Sabbath, I don't think he would say, hey, throw the Sabbath out the window.
Ignore the Sabbath. Yeah, that's right. That goes against other things that he's written. Right.
It's not the only time that this is mentioned, in the Bible. In Hebrews 10:1, it says, the law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. So we see that same thing, right?
Yeah.
The law is the shadow.
Right.
Of the good thing to come, not the reality. And of course, Paul kind of adds on to that. The reality is Christ. And we were talking about this earlier. So the shadow being kind of the law, it's an interesting idea because he's not saying, "Oh, the shadow's pointless."
Right. The law. It's not that the law doesn't matter.
Right. But the law was pointing to something.
Right. And the law can't completely describe reality.
Yeah. The law is pointing to something, and I guess in both of these, there is a idea of the shadow of pointing to the reality of something that is coming, right?
Okay.
Or in the case of Christ, that finally arrived.
Right. The completion.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
So, I think if we really think about kind of the other areas where Paul talks about the shadow versus reality, the reality is Christ, I think it's clear that the shadow played a part, right? The shadow said something is present, something is coming.
Right.
And we could even go back through the entire history of the Old Testament, maybe even, and say the law was the shadow pointing to something.
Yeah.
And it was good to understand the shadow. It was good to understand the shape, what to watch for, maybe.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, Jesus said, I didn't come to undo the law.
Yeah.
I didn't come to overthrow it.
Yeah.
I came to complete it. And so it's this idea that we think, it's a lot of times we talk about the Bible, we think of it in terms of, man, it's a bunch of rules. It's a bunch of don't do this, right?
Yeah.
And that's a misunderstanding of what the Bible is trying to communicate. And there are the rules on there. The law was put into place by Moses for guidelines, but the Jews and ultimately, and then further on, the Pharisees, they saw the law as what was reality. They kept pointing to the law.
Yeah.
And they were hung up on the idea of the law. This is what matters. Hey, Moses came down off the Mount Sinai with the stone tablets.
Yeah.
How in the world are you going to say that this doesn't matter? And that's not what Jesus is saying. He's saying that it's not that it didn't matter. It's that it was pointing to something else, and you've lost. You're focusing on the shadow now.
You spent so much time focusing on the shadow and what it was that you lost sight of what it was pointing to. So over time, you mistook the shadow for the reality.
Right.
Which I think it's kind of an interesting way I would say it's an interesting way to think about the Old Testament and the Old Testament law, but then we just read Hebrews where basically that's exactly what he says. Like, the law was the shadow pointing to something greater, pointing to the ideal.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
So let's then go talk about what Paul is telling to the Colossian church, because he's like, don't let anyone judge you by new moon festival, what you eat or drink, Sabbath day.
Right.
So I think we can say, well, here's what I would say maybe is that those things had value. They're helping shape a person's faith. Maybe they serve some good things for the Colossian church initially.
Yeah.
But when people started judging others by them, then Paul's like, again, no, you're mistaking the shadow
Right.
for what it's pointing to,
Yeah, that's right.
You're interpreting the shadow as reality.
Right. Yeah. And it's kind of like, when you raise kids, when they're young, you got a bunch of rules, man. Don't touch that, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Don't mess with that knife. Don't, you have all these rules, and it's just a bunch of don't do this, right? And the goal is not to have them ever, just remember and write down all these rules and say, well, that's the absolute way to live my life, is never to touch knives or something. It's like no. I want you to grow, and I want you to mature, and I want you to get to a point where you can handle a knife.
Yeah.
I want you to get to the point where you can live on your own and know what to do with an electric socket and know what to do with, right? And so yeah, it's not that the rules don't matter, but it's just interesting, and you see this over and over, is that the rules many, many times become the reality. And you see it in governments, you see it in, these big, huge companies, you see it in bureaucracies, right? Is that they get overwhelmed and laden down with the rules. And that becomes the primary way that they view reality, right?
The reality is all the rules.
Is the rules. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And that's kind of interesting, because we talk about it, well, there tends to be rule followers and rule breakers.
Yeah.
Right? And which one are you? And do you follow the rules or do you break the rules? That type thing.
Yeah.
And what Paul's talking about is pointing to the shadows, pointing to something else, pointing to ultimate reality. What he's pointing at and saying is that no, there's a tension between those two ideas. The rules matter. They point to something. Recognize what they're there for. You know, but at the same time, I want you to live beyond the rules. Maybe what is that?
Yeah.
What's your take on that? To
so
live in a way. You don't want to say live in a way that the rules don't matter.
No, but I think there's whether you look at you can think of athletes. Sometimes you can think of musicians. Rules have to be the starting point, right?
Yeah,
you have to
have
understand.
Yeah,
you have to understand the rules of the game,
right?
And whether that's how to write music, whether that's playing in a band, whether that's understanding what the game of basketball is supposed to be about.
Yeah.
You have to understand the rules of the game. So the rules, I think the rules are the fundamentals. Anyone who truly, I think, you could say, transforms whatever they're working on, whether it's a piece of art or a band, or an athlete.
Yeah.
There's a point at which they go beyond rule followers, because here's the way I would say it. They understand the spirit of the game.
Yeah.
So they're not a rule breaker, and they're no longer necessarily a rule follower, but they understand the rules to such an extent that they somehow elevate the game.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
And you can think of an example of, we've been listening to we've been listening to like Red Hot Chili Peppers or Rage Against the Machine, of course, like when we get together, that's our thing. And with these guitar riffs, and some of these guitarists, you can think of like Flea or Tom Morello, or it's like they don't follow the rules anymore.
Yeah.
But they had to start with them.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I think I think everybody that changes the game, so to speak, whether it's Michael Jordan or Steph Curry or Jimi Hendrix, we describe them as, man, they were before their time, or they really changed the game. And what that is not that they didn't have any recognition for the rules or how to play the game, but they elevated that and made the game their own. And and took it to an art form that said, I'm beyond worrying about how to dribble the ball, or you know what I mean, the simple things, right?
Yeah.
And I've gone past that to create something new.
Yeah.
And see, that kind of goes back to that idea of the creative force we talked about last week, that when you understand the spirit of the rules, the spirit of the game, the spirit of the law, it frees you up to be creative in different ways. And that's a little bit uncomfortable for the fundamentalists or the rule followers, right?
Yeah, the rule followers.
It's a little bit uncomfortable to say, wait a second, you saying the rules don't matter? It's like, no, that's what we're trying to flesh out, right? Explain what that means. And I like that idea I like the idea of tension. I like the idea of, the prodigal son parable, where you've got the young son that ignores all the rules. He lives life his own way. He takes his father's money and runs. Right?
Yeah.
He's living outside of the rules. He's not interested in the law or anything else that has to do with it. Right? And we know what happens to him. He ends up eating with the pigs.
Yeah.
But then on the other end of that extreme is you got the older son who's resentful, and he tells his father, "Man, I kept all the rules."
And he followed all the rules.
Yeah,
he was the
I followed
rule
all the
follower,
rules, and I've done what you do, and you never gave me anything for me and my friends to eat, right? And he becomes resentful because he thought following the rules was
the reality.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that's right.
Right.
Sure, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And the idea is, well, obviously don't be the young son, but also don't be the older son, and find that tension between those two extremes and hold on to the middle where you embrace the spirit of the rules while at the same time having the character to be creative and create something new.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think it's easy at first pass to read those verses, don't let anyone judge you by this or that, and fall to those two extremes we've been talking about. You're a rule follower or you're a rule breaker,
Right.
I'm a rebel, forget all the rules, I'm going to break them. Now, that's not what Paul's talking about.
Right.
Nor is he talking about like, hey, I'm a conformist. Tell me what the rules of the game are, and I'll follow them to a T.
Right.
Paul was wanting them to think beyond that. And I think when you understand the value of rules, I think you understand that the rules, again, the shadow versus the reality, the rules point to the spirit, Plato would say the ideal, of something bigger.
Right.
You have to go through the fundamentals, the steps of the rules first to understand the spirit. Once you fully grasp the spirit, once you have a clear view of the ideal, you don't need to be reliant on the rules that you had to kind of go through in order to understand that. So the rules aren't pointless.
Sure.
They're not meaningless.
Yeah.
They're there. They're pointed you to something. But once you catch a glimpse of the thing they were pointing to, you're much less reliant on all the rules, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
And so I think that's what Paul's really getting at here.
Yeah, and he talks about freedom in Christ. And he's not talking about freedom from rules. He's talking about about keeping your eye on the ideal, and once you have the spirit of the ideal and you embrace that and you clothe yourself with that, that does free you up. There is freedom in that.
Yeah.
That you're not worried. You're not being a Pharisee and worried about how much you can eat on the Sabbath before you're breaking Sabbath law, or all the little things that they were nitpicking about, right? Because the idea of rules is to create a structure for kind of the lowest common denominator, right? That the dumbest guy in the room, as long as he reads the rules and knows the rules, he can navigate through this, right?
Yeah.
And there is a space for that because we were all immature at one time and things like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, the ultimate goal is not to live within those rules like a Pharisee.
Yeah.
But to understand the spirit of it and be able to operate beyond that.
Yeah.
Or with the ideal in mind, not the rules in mind. Yeah, that's really starting to make sense. Yeah.
There's this Netflix show that I love. I'm actually rewatching it, and it's about to leave Netflix, but it's called, it's a funny name, it's Shtisel. But it's a great
Jewish?
show. Yeah.
Okay.
It's about a Jewish Orthodox family living in Jerusalem.
Okay.
And it's fascinating on so many levels. First of all, great storytelling. I love the show. But they portray Orthodox life. You see these conversations that these people are having about what they can and can't do on the Sabbath, and you hear them kind of quoting, this rabbi says this and this rabbi says that, and and the Mishnah and the Torah, and you hear them just debating, and I find myself coming from a non-Jewish background, going, what, like, don't you understand the spirit of the Sabbath, and why do you need all these? Now, there's a lot to be commended. In the show, they kind of portray how studious they are of Torah, and there's a lot to admire about that. But then I think about, Jesus comes and says, man was not made for the Sabbath. Sabbath was made for man. The Sabbath was a shadow pointing to something, right?
Yeah, that's right.
There again, I think that's kind of the spirit. Like, it's pointing you to the ideal. It's pointing you to the spirit.
Yeah.
And the more you understand the ideal, the less reliant you have to be on the rules. But you also are becoming a kind of person who isn't just going to blatantly break all the rules because you want to be a huge rebel, right?
Right. Because I want to be my own person, independent of the ideal.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
Okay.
the rules are oppressive. I'm going to toss them all off, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not understanding the spirit of the rule either, right?
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, I don't like rules, so I kind of gravitate toward this idea. But my tendency is to, well, exactly like you said, ignore the rules and think, oh man, they're oppressive. Forget that. I don't need to follow that rule, And if I know myself, I know that that's where I tend to lean. And if you're an obsessive rule follower, know yourself there and know that, hey, there's actually freedom in embracing the ideal and focusing on that and not the rules. So I think a lot of this is kind of know yourself, know your tendencies, whether you tend to be a little bit of a rebellious young son, young prodigal, or whether you tend to be a type A rule follower, older son, right?
Yeah.
And kind of know where you land on that, and find that middle ground, find that tension, but find it through the ideal. I said earlier about trying to find that tension to create something new, and that was a little bit of a mistake. What I meant to say was find that tension and focus on the ideal, because I don't want to paint this picture like, hey man, you can transcend the rules and make it up as you go along or something like that. I'm not saying as long as you have the ideal, you clothe yourself with the ideal, clothe yourself with Christ, then you can work to be beyond the rules, and there's freedom in that when you focus on the ideal, because that's what we're supposed to achieve, and that's what we're supposed to shoot for, strive for.
Yeah, so we're called to transform into the image of Christ, right? That's what we're called to do.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think what Paul's trying to say is you're never going to do that by just following the rules.
Yeah.
And you can see how in Colossae you can imagine how people were judging others by what they were participating in, whether or not they were following all the rules. And, here's at the church, that's taboo. We don't do that,
Right.
And Paul's like, look, okay, you got to lay the ground rules, but you're not transforming into the image of Christ. The reality is found in Christ. That's what he says.
You're transforming to the image of the rules.
Yeah, you're transforming into the
right,
that's
which
a good
is
way
a Pharisee,
to say it.
Sure, yeah.
And then on the other hand, I like that idea of we tend to go, I'm a rule breaker or a rule follower.
Right.
I'm probably more on the rule follower, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
But I would almost say, we, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, but also, it's not that we want to find the middle ground. It's actually we want to find the spirit and the tension between that two. And like you said, we want the ideal.
Right.
That's found in the tension, maybe.
Yeah.
So it's not just to kind of, I'm going to balance the two. Like, no, what's the spirit that all this is pointing to, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
That's what we're shooting for.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, so I think that's the path of transformation. It's interesting that later on in the same chapter, if we kind of start to wrap this up, Paul actually continues on. Don't let anyone do this, disqualify you, and they go into great detail, and they're not very humble. But he gets to this verse 21 where he says, do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. And I can almost imagine Paul just kind of like, almost yelling these things like, guys, this is not the point of the life that you were called to live. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that,
Yeah. Well, and he goes on and says, all these regulations refer to what is destroyed by being used up. They are commands and doctrines of men. So what explain that one. All these regulations refer to what is destroyed by being used up.
Yeah, so in another version that actually probably says a little more clear, it says these rules, which have to do with things that are destined to perish with use. So
okay.
I think what it's getting at there is if you're only following the rules, you're playing a game that has a short lifespan.
Yeah. It's not going to last.
It's not going to last. Yeah.
Again, you're focusing on the rules as being the ideal.
Yeah.
And that's not going to last because the ideal is actually going to.
The rules are not the reality.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
The rules help point us, shape us. They define the game for us. But unless we're actually looking at what the rules are pointing us to, then we're really missing the point.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's good. And it is interesting the way Paul really kind of meticulously teases this idea out because it is something that if you start saying, well, hey, listen, the rules don't matter. The immediate response is, whoa, wait a second now.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about anarchy. You're talking about chaos in society and things like that. The rules of the road matter. You can't just say make it up as you go along. And so he does a great job of going back and forth, kind of like holding that tension of the rules are a shadow. They're pointing to the ideal, but don't mistake the shadows for the ideal. Focus on the ideal.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's how we can put on Christ.
Yeah, so I think when we understand that this idea of the shadow versus the reality was a common theme, really, in their culture, they would have immediately latched onto it, and they probably would have understood it probably a little quicker than we understand it reading this
right. Yeah, they wouldn't
today. So I think that's a good way to kind of wrap this up. But do you have any last thoughts about, like, okay, how can we use this today?
Yeah, I just kind of, and we got a little bit tied up in the rules and the shadows and things like that. But kind of to summarize, I would just say what Paul's saying is don't measure your faith by the check boxes. Don't measure your faith by the rules, and don't measure your faith by what other people are doing. Because there's a tendency to compare yourself to other people and say, well, man, that guy's in church every time the doors are open, and I'm not that guy.
Yeah.
And he's saying don't get caught up in that.
Yeah.
Stay focused on the ideal, and that's your goal. That's what you're aiming toward. And the rules can point you to that. That's fine. They're a guide. But yeah, don't measure your faith on the fact of how many times you're at church, on how often you read the Bible or something like that.
Yeah.
All that stuff is important, but the ideal is something deeper than that, and that's something we need to strive to embody.
Well, and we've talked about this before, but especially in younger people, college, just graduated, there's a tendency to measure their progress based on what all their peer groups are doing.
Right.
So I should be married by now. I should have a good job by now.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the moving away from just the spiritual to life in general, but I think that's what we do.
Right.
When we don't have the ideal in mind, we tend to we look around us to see, okay, this is what I should be doing right now. Right. And that's not always a great place to look.
No, goodness, no. I mean, well, first of all, there are no perfect circles, right? There is the ideal circle. So quit looking at the imperfect circles around you and saying, well, better than what I am, or something like that.
Yeah.
Aim toward the ideal. And also, we talked about this in other podcasts. It's like growth happens in the wilderness, man.
Yeah.
And the idea that I should be in a certain spot, well, maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't. But it's in those honest moments where you look in the mirror and you say, man, I'm not really where I should be. That's the wilderness, and that's where growth happens. And embrace that. Let that drive you instead of let that pull you into a depression or something like that. And certainly don't do it by comparing yourself to other people. Yeah.
Well, that actually feeds in pretty well to what I was kind of thinking about wrapping up with too, is that, one of the things that the cave teaches is that the transition from the shadows to reality isn't a pleasant one always. And I think if you apply that to following Christ, I think the more freedom you feel of moving away from rules to pursuing the ideal, it's not always going to be happy and comfortable and a safe place to be. It's going to be that wilderness, right? It's disconcerting to find yourself suddenly in a place where none of the rules you've always relied on apply.
Yeah, because when you're in the unknown, I mean, what do we want to do? I want to get out the rule book. I want to get out the instruction manual.
Yeah, someone tell me what to do.
Yeah, give me a map, man. Where am I?
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah, and so I think that's actually a part of the natural progression of moving towards spiritual transformation as you aim at the ideal of Christ is you are going to have times where, man, things are disconcerting, things are unfamiliar. You're going to want to run back to the rules, actually.
Yeah, that's right. There's comfort in the simplicity of the rules.
Yeah. And one of the things Paul's saying is don't run back there.
Right.
Keep moving forward,
Yeah.
Keep your eyes on the ideal, which is Christ.
Yeah, I like that.
Well, so I think that's probably a good place to wrap up. Next episode, we'll be talking about chapter 3, and we're going to talk about, again, the other big idea.
All right.
And
you got something to tease us with on chapter 3?
Yeah, so chapter 3 is another image that I love, and when you really flesh this image out, that of baptism, maybe being an initiation rite. And again,
Okay.
you have to think how the first century audience would have heard it, but there's a lot of implications of this idea of initiating yourself into a mystery religion. That's the little teaser.
All right, I like it. Yep, look forward to that.
Well, thanks for listening today. Hopefully, like us, you were challenged. You think about some of these verses in a different way. Some of the things you've always heard in church, maybe you go, "Oh, wow, I didn't think of that." So
yeah, a lot of the conversations we have, I run back to my Bible and write in the margins.
Okay.
These ideas, like, I got to remember this because 5 years from now, I might forget this idea.
Yeah.
But no, I definitely kind of take notes on this.
And if you enjoyed this perspective, one of the things I've done is I've written a book called A Journey Through Colossae, where I really get into the background of the city of Colossae, Paul's relationship with it, and then really go more of the verse by verse of where Paul's taking this letter to the Colossians. So pick that up. It's on Amazon. It's available through ebook, wherever you get ebooks, things like that. You can also find it, links to the website, and our website is navigatinganancientfaith.com.
And if you like the podcast, subscribe. We've got other episodes on there. Join the conversation. And yeah, it's been great.
Yeah. We'll talk to you next episode.
All right. See y'all.